All right, Jason, you ready?
Yeah.
All right, we're live.
No, I didn't get a countdown. All right. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed the keynote speaker and gained some insight, from his orbital perspective. So next up, we have James Rankin. He's joining us from the UK. He's an EUC consultant and will be presenting on Logon Optimizations, busting the myths. So let's start off with some trivia. And I'm Jason Helms, by the way, one of the local leaders for CUGC for Kansas City. And here's some trivia. Okay, and you can answer all of these within the group chat, but the first question is, what year did Nebraska become a U.S. state? And you guys can enter your answers in the group chat. Kevin K, 1867. Good job. You won that one. Audio alerts. You're right. Kill those. All right. Good job, Kevin K. Answer 16. Okay, because hardly any trees grew on the prairies, how many of the first settlers built their homes? How many of the first settlers built their homes out of what? So what did the first settlers build their houses out of? All right. We got Donna B was correct with sod. Sod. I don't know what the difference between sod and straw is, but I think they're the same. All right. What U.S. city has the most barbecue restaurants per capita than any other U.S. city? Oh man, Jeff K out of the gate. Kansas City. All right, good job, guys. So the guys I announced, just email Jennifer Gibbons. She'll have your email. Let her know what you answered, and we're moving on. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to James now.
Hello. I'm still getting to terms with coming to terms with the amount of windows I've got going on here, because obviously I'm using a new platform here, and there's so much stuff going on which normally I don't have when I'm doing a presentation, but it's all good. And a bit tough for me actually going after a guy who's actually been to space, because as some of you may know, I won't even get on an aeroplane, which is probably why I should sort of say a bit of a thank you to the coronavirus pandemic, because otherwise presenting at an American user group would be something I'd probably never be able to do. So I suppose spinning the coronavirus in a positive light isn't something that happens very often, although it has done quite a lot for digital transformation in my customer environments as well. Anyway, so today I'm here to sort of talk about Logon Optimizations, which is something I've done quite a lot of on Citrix. and Windows. I've been recently doing kind of like a real deep dive, which I've only just started putting together, kind of blog and article-wise. And what I'm going to try and tell you is, what parts, if you want to optimize your logon on Citrix, right, what parts of it are really, really worth going after? Where are you going to see the best bits? And are there any bits that might not be worth putting your energies towards at all, because you're not going to see any benefit or even an adverse benefit? And I hope I'm not going to debunk any of my own work in the process. So just a quick bit of shameless self-promotion before we get started. As I said, my name's James Rankin. I'm a current Citrix CTP. I work in a few different industry verticals, normally with lots of different customers, but for the last couple of years, I've been doing quite a lot of my work in the financial services area. I have a blog at james-rankin.com where I write up all of my articles. I am on Twitter as well, so if I publish any articles for different industry websites, which occasionally I do, then obviously I will aggregate all of my stuff there. And I do have a YouTube channel as well now, which I'm kind of trying to get off the ground a bit. It's a bit of an odd one trying to run a YouTube channel, because if you want hits on your YouTube channel, you've got to do things that are a bit more basic, around the sort of computing side to try and help people out. But also I put on there as well kind of video guides and things like that to, often supporting the articles that I do and things like that. So come along and subscribe to me on YouTube. Search for James Rankin on YouTube. I'm not the pilot. The pilot has much more interesting videos than me. I am the next one down in the list. But if I get over 1,000 subscribers, apparently I qualify for monetization. So there you go. I am shamelessly begging for subscribers just to try and get myself some YouTube monetization, which will probably add up to not very much at all. So anyway, let's just think about when we're talking about logons, right? Why are logons so important? And the reason that logons kind of come to the fore over and over again is because we're always talking about user experience, right? User experience has been a focus of all of ours, whether we're architects, consultants, admins, whatever, for quite a number of years. Now, user experience is kind of partly subjective, it's partly objective, but from a technical area, we can measure parts of this in many ways. Because, many things go together to make up the user experience. For instance, a user might have an uncomfortable chair, that makes their user experience quite bad of using a system as a whole. But that's not something we have any control over as techies. But there are lots of things that do contribute to the user experience that we do have control over as techies, and it's very important to kind of bring these things together and try and measure them in some sort of holistic way. So things that make up user experience, as we've said, are logon times. We also have application launch times, how those applications perform, particularly when it gets down to doing more complicated tasks within a session. Maybe you have a report that you run, or you've got to crunch some numbers or something like that, or you've got to, go through a certain sort of process to open particular documents, access certain data. The way that you do those and how quickly they respond all adds up to user experience. Another thing that often I, as an admin, tend to forget about when we're talking about user experience is how long it takes to print and things like that. I've seen places where, particularly in Citrix environments, where it gets very neglected, and users try and print something and it takes 5 minutes when really it should be a lot quicker. So those are all the things that go together to make up this kind of holistic sort of thing that we call the user experience. I think a good point to make as well is that admins are users too, right? So, don't forget about the administrators and don't forget about their experience. When you're designing a system, make sure that the admins don't get frustrated as well. It's just as important as user experience. And the important point to make really is that it's got to the stage where if you don't have a good user experience, or if you have a poor user experience, then users will get frustrated, they'll get annoyed. The worst case scenario is they might leave, or they might impact their business productivity. So from a business perspective, user experience as a whole is very, very important. Now, the reason that logon times always come to the fore when we're talking about user experience is because they are the first contact that any user has with the system, and hence my Star Trek first contact image here, in case that was confusing you as to the reference. But a logon time basically colors the logon experience, colors the user experience from that point onwards. So if you've got a system that's responsive and performant in every way, but it has a bad logon experience, the user's perception of that generally will be that it's bad, right? So it's important to make sure that that kind of first contact, that first experience that a user has with the system is good. And I mean, there are other kind of first areas, you know, I mean, if a user turns up and they haven't got a username or a password, or the password or their account's locked or not set up or something like that, that could be argued to be more of a prior contact. But generally, when you're using a system day to day, the logon experience is the most important one. You need to get that right. Make sure it's at what you would consider to be an acceptable level. Now, this is a bit of a kind of an odd point that I'm going to make here, but what do we actually mean by logon time? Now, when we talk about it technically, it's the time it takes from the user initiating a connection until the shell or program that they've requested is fully loaded. And all sorts of things are done in this time, you know, the connection's broke, the session's launched, policies are processed, etc., and the session starts. But for a user, there can be a bit of disconnect in this, right? Because a user thinks it's the time from when they request an application or desktop until the time that they can actually use that application or desktop. And this is a bit of an important distinction to make, because there can be a little bit of difference between what we're recording as the logon time and what the user thinks the time is until they are actually able to start working. And so we've got to try and quantify that slightly. Now, obviously, when we talk about measuring logon times and, you know, optimizing logon times, you have to have data, right? Without data on logon times, we can't justify anything because we are solely reliant on the user's opinion. But the thing is, once you get to that stage, you've got to make sure you get effective data so that you can measure it and assess it and baseline it and look for any trends and whatnot. There are lots. One of the first considerations, that you want to think about is, should I have agent-based monitoring or agentless monitoring? In general, agent-based is the best. You know, you get more data points, you get more accuracy, you can look at much more in-depth into that session. So generally, unless you've got some constraint, always go for a proper agent-based monitoring. There's loads of monitoring tools you can use to measure logon times and many other things besides. Some of the ones that I've worked with quite a lot are listed here: Uber Agent, EG Innovations, Control Up, Goliath Technologies, NextThink, etc. I'm not going to do a bake-off of them because there's a huge amount of factors in the equation about monitoring tools. You can think about cost, flexibility, complexity, infrastructure requirements, etc. But what you need to do is you need to find something that you rely on, that's accurate. And when it comes to doing baselining and testing, it's very important to take an initial baseline and then retest that baseline every time you make a change to the image or the infrastructure components that support the delivery of that image. And if possible, make sure that you verify that as well. So what actually happens during the Windows logon process? Now, you can break down, and we're talking Windows here, obviously not Linux or anything like that. You can break down the logon process into a huge amount of data. I remember Brian Madden and Kevin Goodman years ago broke down the XenApp logon process into an enormously complicated and really fantastic diagram. Even technology such as one of the tools I mentioned earlier, Goliath Technologies, I think breaks the logon down into 40 separate stages. But for, you know, kind of my own sanity, really, I tend to generally think of a logon in these, a Citrix logon, in these 6 sort of stages. Now, these stages that I've got listed here, which go left to right, top to bottom, obviously, they're all sequential. So each one must complete before the next one commences. So at the start, we've got session initialization, which is kind of, you know, mainly a Citrix stroke RDSH sort of thing, in which, you know, a user requests to launch a resource and that connection is brokered, so, you know, a VDA is found for them to run on. If it's a desktop, it'll be powered up, the ICA files pass back to the client, etc., etc. It measures loads, does lots of Citrixy stuff in that bit of session initialization. Then the next phase is authentication. So the user is presented with a logon box and their credentials are passed to that. Now, their credentials are either passed through automatically using pass-through authentication, or in some cases, you have to actually log on again at the VDA level. Once that's done, we then move to the next stage, which is user profile. At this stage, a profile for the user will be located and loaded, or if it can't find one, it will create one from the default profile or whatever template it is specified to use. If for some reason it can't find a profile to create it from, you'll be logged on with a temporary profile, but that's what happens at the profile load phase. Any profile management software that you have in play will kind of kick in at this stage and take over. Once the user's profile is loaded, we move on to the users group policy. The users group policies are fetched and they are run to completion. We then have a phase after this that generally kind of applies to desktops. It's called the user init phase. It basically prepares itself for the shell launch, establishes network connections, and also does a thing that we'll talk about a little bit later on called active setup. And the final stage is called the shell stage. And at this point, if you're a desktop resource, it will launch the specified shell, which 99 million times out of a billion should be Explorer, I would have thought. Or if it's a published app that you're running, it will launch the application that is specified in the initial program launch there. So that's kind of like a sort of a cut down view of the sequential phases of a Windows logon. So the bit that I mentioned already earlier, but you need to kind of remember that there is a kind of more human element to logon times, right? So as administrators, sometimes we kind of use a bit of smoke and mirrors, for want of a better term, to improve the perception of your logon times. So on Citrix, a lot, you use something like session pre-launch. So the actual logon is done prior to the user requesting the resource. So when they do request the resource, it appears to launch very quickly. And in that case, a user is going to think that the logon is actually much faster than your data actually shows. Now, on the flip side of this, what a lot of admins sometimes do is they kind of offload certain tasks until after the shell has actually started or the application's actually started. And this is commonly done with things like Citrix Workspace Environment Management or Ivanti User Workspace Manager or something like that. So the logon data reports the shell or the program starting at a specific point in time. So that's officially how long the logon's taken. But for the user, if you've offloaded a lot of tasks till afterwards, often, you know, the system's still kind of churning away a bit and using a lot of resource, and the user's still not quite able to work in that phase. So, you know, the user's perception of the time spent on the what I call the TTOE, the time to operational effectiveness, rather than the logon time, is quite different. And I mean, you often get this with programs like Teams and Skype, that after your logon is finished, they load up automatically in the background. And you know, as far as the user's concerned, they're still not ready to use the system. So this all adds on to the user's perception of that. And I think the important point to make is, you know, measure your logon times using a monitoring tool, right? And look at that baseline. But every time you make a change, right, also go and log on physically yourself and see how long does it take you to get to the stage where you can do something. And be careful to identify if there's a big disconnect between what your data says and what the actual user is experiencing. Because you may be doing them a little bit of a disservice if you're just offloading everything from the logon till later on and just making their session, you know, drag until they can actually, until that finishes and they actually get some work done. So it's important to keep an eye on that as well. You don't need to obsess about it, you know, like measuring it 10, 20 times a day. But just every time you make a change and you think the logon time is at whatever level it's at, then make sure you go and actually see what it looks like from the real human perspective. So moving on from that, another interesting point to look at, and what can be a bit of a prickly point, is how fast does a logon actually need to be? Now, it can get kind of obsessive for people to try and shave more time off to try and improve the experience for the users. But if you start taking it to the extreme, you know, what what if you're actually doing the opposite, right? Now, there are some industry verticals where your logon time or your TTOA or whatever I've decided to call it is vital, right? Healthcare has got to be one of these. You know, the time it takes to log on could mean the difference between somebody living and dying. There's also the likes of investment banking. If you've ever worked with investors, every millisecond counts to these guys and girls. And you know, that speed of response can translate into hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So for particular sectors, you can argue that shaving every second off that logon time is a viable pursuit with a net business benefit. But if you're in a sector that doesn't have that incredible reliance on speed, right, you may need to adopt a more sort of nuanced approach. Now, your average common or garden user will allow a certain period of time before they think a logon is taking too long. And it can be proportional to what they are used to. So imagine users who currently have got a 2-minute logon, right? Now, if you make their logon go from 2 minutes down to 50 seconds, then it's going to feel much faster, right? But if you've got a logon time, you know, a healthy one of maybe about 15 seconds, and you reduce that by 1 or 2 seconds, do you think they're even going to notice that? You know, and it's important to think about what you're trying to achieve when you look at this. Now, as a rule of thumb, many people say that 30 seconds or less is an acceptable time for a logon. It's a good logon. So I try and take this a bit further. I have my own little mantra down here when dealing with this. I aim for 10 seconds, but I will always accept 20 seconds, and I'll make a sort of pledge to myself not to go beyond 30 seconds. And this serves me pretty well outside of these extreme environments like healthcare and investment banking. So if you get it down to 20 seconds or under, you know, you aim for 10, you set your sights quite high, but if you get it down to under 20 seconds, then really, is there any reason to expend a lot of energy on it unless you work in one of these absolutely time-critical industry verticals? Now, this doesn't mean you can just relax as soon as you get under 20 seconds. You still need to monitor it. So if you get it down to, I don't know, 18 seconds and then 1 week it jumps up to 21, go and find out why that change has happened, you know. And again, this is where your monitoring comes to the fore. Now, there's another interesting point that we've all heard about that's worth bringing attention to, is this anecdote about cost savings through improving logon times, right? When we've all heard variants of it, I've heard vendors actively pitching with these sorts of things. They say, for instance, you've got 10,000 users and it takes them all 2 minutes to log on every day. So if we reduce that to 30 seconds, every day your users are doing 250 hours more work between them, and that saves you whatever huge number 250 extra man hours per day adds up to over a year. And it all sounds very impressive. I've seen people buy software based on these kinds of cost sort of projections, right? Is it accurate? Probably not, right? User productivity really doesn't depend on when they get logged in, and you know, everyone doesn't just stop being productive at their exact moment their shift finished. There are too many factors in play here to make their claims, and I've never seen any data that really backs this up, even in call centers, which are horrendously aggressively micromanaged environments. However, to be fair, what an improved logon time does give, if it's noticeable enough, is an improvement in user satisfaction, right? So they don't start their days off being frustrated. And as I said, their acceptance is driven by logon time. So, you know, happier users are generally more productive. They're less likely to take time off. They're less likely to be involved in disciplinaries. And for these sorts of anecdotes, there is data available to back it up, right? So logon time should be looked at as part of a general focus on user experience, right? Rather than being obsessive about that particular one thing. You need to try and improve the satisfaction of the user base, and you look at the logon times because it's the first time they interact with the system. So as I said, if you work in an industry sector where every second counts, then yes, aim as high as you can. Aim for the best possible logon time, which is about 5 or 6 seconds in an absolutely perfect environment. But also, if you do go that aggressive, you also have to remember that the road to hell is always paved with good intentions. You have to make sure that every optimization you're applying doesn't have knock-on effects that affect other aspects of your environment. So as I said, if you get under 20 seconds, then don't obsess about it too much. You know, if you drop from 1 minute down to 20 seconds, then your users will be happier. But if you drop from 20 to 15, would they even notice? It's an interesting point to maybe put out there and ask them. So finally, I've got through all my conversation about why should we care about logon times and what is a good logon time. So let's have a look at what sort of things amongst the common optimizations you can see out there, what is worth actually looking at in terms of what's good, what can make a big difference. Now, out of those kind of 6 sort of areas that I called out, the 6 stages of that sequential logon, in my experience, and this still stands, the 2 areas that you really need to concentrate on, where you'll see possibly the biggest benefits, are group policy and user profiles. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the aspects of GPO optimization because there are lots and lots of them that you can do. So I'm going to try and call out the ones where you'll probably see the most tangible difference if you're looking just to improve your logon times. Now, on the right-hand side of this image here, because I'm having to tell you which image I'm referring to, because I put some little transitions in via PowerPoint which don't work, and I was warned before I compose my presentation, so I'm an idiot. On the right-hand side is an example of group policy design from my lab, right? Now, it may sound a bit sort of trite, but getting the design right is very important, because if you go for a nested kind of design in your Active Directory and therefore your group policy OUs, what you do is you avoid a lot of complex filtering. And in my experience, getting away from complex filtering doesn't just improve your actual processing times, it also improves the amount of management that you've got to spend on working out where group policies are going wrong. Now, we move over to the left-hand side, and again, this is a big sort of area that I'd like to call out. This is a shot from an OU in my lab with a huge set of group policy objects applied to it, right? Now, this is the wrong way to do it. I've basically gone down here, down the avenue of 1 setting per GPO. Now, for troubleshooting, this is absolutely fabulous, right? Because if something goes wrong, you just disable the GPO you think that's at fault, and you quickly find out what it is. However, if you want, for each GPO, right, it's got to have the client-side extension loaded and pulled in from the sysvol directory and processed. So if you want to make a difference to your logon times in terms of user group policy processes, then you really should organize them as it shows in that kind of big image in the middle there. That's showing the same OU, the OU called ZenApp. But what we've done is we've consolidated all of those settings into 3 specific GPOs. Now, you don't put them all in 1 GPO. The ideal way to do it is to put each GPO should be for a particular client-side extension, right? You can get the list of client-side extensions within group policy from anywhere. There are lots and lots of them, but the biggest one by far is the one at the top there that says admin templates. You'll have lots and lots of settings in admin templates, and then you can put other ones for things like Citrix policies and group policy preferences drive maps, as we've done here. That'll make a hell of a lot of difference. I have seen a place where it was taking something like 28 seconds to process group policy, with it broken down into like literally hundreds of settings they had applied to OUs, put them into things that were just single CSAs, and we cut that more than in half just by doing that, right? It made a huge difference. Yes, it was an extreme case, but it is a way you can make a lot of difference. So always go for that. Don't go for 1 setting, 1 GPO. Go for 1 client-side extension, 1 GPO. Now, at the top there, I've got an image that you probably recognize, which is about loopback policy processing. Again, this is a quick win when it comes down to user group policy processing. Basically, the best thing to do is to always use replace mode, because that means that you only ever have 1 pass done rather than 2. Merge mode needs 2. Just spotted a question coming in there, and I bet I know exactly what this question is. Exactly. Citrix policies, group policy, or Citrix Studio? I prefer to have them in group policy, really, because I am usually in a situation where I'm allowed at group policy in Airday. So there's none of that problem that you often find where you have to manage them separately. And I prefer to put them in there specifically for the same reason that I've just said here, that we can organize them in these ways that is, not capable by doing them in Citrix Studio. However, as I said, I'm doing a Logon Times very deep dive series at the minute, and that's one of the questions I've got down to answer, to actually see is there any difference between how they're processed from the Citrix policies or from the actual group policies themselves. So it's going to be interesting to see how they interplay with each other, because essentially the Citrix CSE is separate, but it's also separate in group policy. But yeah, generally I prefer to do them within group policy management console itself wherever possible. The other bit I was going to mention after loop back was asynchronous and synchronous policy processing. Now, along with your your policy sort of setup, synchronous policy processing does everything sequentially, whereas asynchronous actually just kind of like lets it rip through them, rather than it doesn't wait until they've all completely finished. They can still be chuntering away slightly in the background when they apply. And now what it is very difficult to enable asynchronous processing, particularly on RDSH, but if you can get it done, it does actually make a really big difference. I had in the lab, I had 10 seconds for user group policy processing time, and it went down to 5 when I made it all asynchronous. So it does make a big difference. The caveat around that is that folder redirection GPOs can't be used. If you're using folder redirection GPOs, it always forces synchronous processing mode. However, you can get around this by actually just using the registry items in group policy preferences to set the user shell folders keys instead. So there is a way around it. So again, that's another biggie that you can get around. Asynchronous processing makes a big difference to your logon time in real terms. So let's talk user profiles, because I said that was possibly the second biggest area that you'd need to concentrate on. So local profiles are always the fastest, right? That goes without saying. However, in Citrix environments, unless you're fully non-persistent desktops, it's very unlikely that you'd ever get to use local profiles. However, if you are fully non-persistent, then always use local profiles. They are the fastest. The load time for a local profile that's already on the machine is less than half a second. I think it's less than a quarter of a second or something like that. It's ridiculously fast. However, if you are in a non-persistent environment, as most of us are, then mounting via VHD is the best way to do your profiles, whether it's using FSLogix or another method. Other VHD mounting solutions are available. Now, if you go from a kind of a file-based profile management piece, like a roaming profile or a Citrix UPM profile, and then you move to VHD, what I often see is that people think smaller profiles load faster. That is correct if you're talking about Citrix UPM without folder redirection and profile streaming, or a standard roaming profile. That is absolutely true. But when you move to a VHD sort of method, such as FSLogix, then the size of it actually becomes pretty much redundant. In my testing, a 500 megabyte VHD loaded at near enough the same speed as a 5 gigabyte VHD. Essentially, it's not loading, right? It's just mounting a file across the network. So what I've seen is, because people think that smaller in VHDs equals better logon, which actually it doesn't, they've also been getting very aggressive with redirections.xml and FSLogix and trying to direct all these caches out of the profile to keep the size down. It really doesn't make a difference. I mean, essentially what you're doing, and people do this for storage reasons as well, but essentially what you're doing is just swapping storage for I/O, right? So as soon as you're logged in, everything starts caching down onto the local disk, all that stuff that you've excluded. So you've just kind of moved the lag somewhere else. So I would basically be very careful about, if you're using a VHD mounting procedure, only exclude something if for storage purposes you absolutely must. I mean, we provisioned over 150 terabytes of cloud storage in my last project to support VHD-based profiles, and it's dirt cheap as well. I do recognize if you're running on premises, you may not have enough that much storage to throw at it. But yeah, don't get carried away with trying to reduce the size of the profiles. If you do need to reduce them, try and run the maintenance offline. Now, when we talk about customizing default profiles as well, that again is another area where you can make a big difference to your initial logon time, particularly on Windows 10. However, and I think this probably should have been the title of this presentation, it should have just been "Be Careful," because I think that's what I find myself saying most of the time when talking about it. When you're customizing the default profile, sometimes, and I am really badly guilty of this, I get really gung-ho. You see the standard default profile now that it spits out, it's about 200 meg, and I think, right, I want that down to 1 megabyte because it's going to be so much faster to load. And actually, it's not. It is a bit faster, but not anywhere near what you think it might be. When you cut down a default profile like that, Windows still has to spit all that stuff out at one point. It's just not there for it to load at first. So on fast networks these days, dragging in 200 meg from the local disk as opposed to dragging in 1 megabyte, it's utterly negligible. But if you do it right, I think you can shave 4-ish, 5-ish seconds off a kind of almost a standard logon time by getting a well-customized default profile. Maybe a bit more if you're on Windows 10. But as I said, if you start going crazy with it and end up messing about with registry permissions and things like that, you're probably going to do more harm than good, because you'll just have swapped a slightly faster logon time for like broken bits of your interface and things like that. So not worth going too far with the default profile. I'll have a quick word about storage and networks, because this should be as fast as possible, and this will make a big difference to your logon time if your storage is currently, or your networks are currently suboptimal, right? And I think in most sort of areas now, people have already got the fastest stuff their budgets can afford. However, one of the bits that might be worth calling out is sometimes I see people with their Citrix infrastructure component servers and things like that are not running on fast storage or fast networks, or not the fastest possible. So just make sure you pay attention to that. I have seen environments where swapping your DDCs and things like that onto faster storage made an appreciable, in terms of seconds, difference to the logon times. You can pretty much say the same for Airday as well. Obviously, Airday is essential for everything, including logon times, because it underpins it all. But the thing is, you'll only be able to make much of a difference to logon times if you've got some existing problems in your environment. If you think you've got problems within Airday, then look at undefined subnets, DNS configuration, things like that. Go and do a deep dive if you feel it's necessary. But I think generally now, people's Airday is normally up to scratch. However, another big one out there is antivirus. And like I said, I think most people have all their antivirus exclusions configured correctly now. However, especially if you're using something like Citrix User Profile Manager, make sure you have got it configured. But a good point to call out, especially when talking about logon times, is check the exclusions for other security tools as well. I've got to put up with things like Cisco AMP and Tanium and things like that, and they're horrendous products. They do nothing but drag things, but because I work in financial services, I've got to make sure you've got all the vendor exclusions in place for those as well. There's also an interesting thing came out to me the other day. We were complaining about Teams performance, and Microsoft suggested, have you got the right exclusions in place for Teams for antivirus? I was like, well, no, I hadn't considered it. Now, when we're talking about logon times, you might be thinking, why would Teams performance make a difference? Well, if your session hosts are under heavy load, which Teams is particularly good at making them under heavy load, then obviously it's going to be a knock-on effect to any new users onto the servers themselves, if you're using XenApp or Windows 10 multi-user or things like that. So try and make sure that you get all the antivirus exclusions in, not just from a logon perspective, but from a performance perspective as well, because performance optimization always, knocks onto logon optimization. And try not to overkill the security tools, unless you're like me and you work in financial services, where overkill is sadly mandatory. Windows Universal Platform apps. Now, these can make a huge difference to your logon times if you get rid of them. However, the obvious thing to call out here is that's only if you're on non-persistent Windows 10. You can drag some of them out of server OSs, but they make a small difference, not as huge a one. But obviously, the thing to remember here as well is don't go mad. As I said, the title of this presentation should just be please be careful with what you're doing. Because if you remove too many things, the obvious one is the likes of calculator. The likes of calculator is the one that people always end up removing from their users, but there's also things like the Windows Store app and things like that, if you remove them, they can have odd little knock-on effects into the user interface. There's also a really cool trick you can do if you're not comfortable removing all the UWP apps, which is called Fast First Signing, which you can basically create a provisioning package, which then ignores the provisioning stage of the first logon, which does make a huge difference to your logon. However, like with everything, be careful, he says again, there are some odd things it does. It configures some user-level GPOs, which basically do weird things like they remove the lock option from the start menu, and they block you from using OneDrive. So as long as you're aware of these, you can override them with domain-level GPOs, but it's a good indication of, you can find these cool optimizations that make a big difference, but you've just got to be aware of what they might introduce into your environment. There is a link down there that talks about how to set that up on my blog if you want. A couple of quick questions around profiles. Don't you think troubleshooting profile issues in FSLogix is not as comfortable as UPM? That's an interesting question. I think that UPM was easier because you could literally just go and dig into the profile because it wasn't exclusively mounted in use like FSLogix is. So you can maybe do things on the back end while the user was logged in and things like that. From that perspective, with FSLogix, you have to get the user to log out, then go and get exclusive access to the profile, and don't forget to unmount it afterwards. But I think in general, I don't see as much problems with UPM as with FSLogix as I did with UPM. With UPM, I had historically a lot of problems with file paths that were longer than the operating system could address, so I couldn't delete profiles and things like that. Had big problems with PST files, things like that. And when we went to FSLogix, those problems just went away. So I think you are trading off. It's a good point, troubleshooting the actual profile-related issues. You are trading off a bit in terms of what you can do while the user's logged in or not even logged in, how granular it can get, but also with getting rid of problems like profiles I couldn't delete. I think it was a decent trade-off. Does the Citrix Optimizer assist with any of these logon issues? Yes, it does. I mean, lots of these things that I've already called out here, particularly about UWP apps and things like that, are in the Citrix Optimizer and the VMware Optimizer as well. So, yeah. And yes, it does overall focus on performance of the VM. But as I said, the performance of your VMs, particularly in shared environments, does knock on to the logon times, right? So Citrix Optimizer is a really great tool. But again, I'm going to say it again, if you just tick all the boxes in the Citrix Optimizer and go crazy with it, then basically you can get yourself in trouble pretty quickly. I thought it wasn't recommended to use FSLogix profiles when using PVS. Not that I'm aware of. I've used it quite a lot in PVS environments, although my current environment, which is my biggest FSLogix deployment so far, is not a PVS environment, so don't take it as read. But I'll do some lookup on that one afterwards and see if I can verify that my current environment we use Terraform and Packer for provisioning, which is absolutely awesome. But I'm going to do a different presentation about that in the future. Quickly moving on. Auto-starting applications, again, this kind of helps you make a difference to the user's perception rather than the real logon time. So have a look at things like Teams and Skype and all the stuff you've got auto-starting. Does it all need to auto-start? Have a real good think about it, because sometimes you've got a lot of stuff in there that it doesn't. Obviously, if you need to do a deep dive on optimization, deep dive on what's auto running, sysinternals auto runs is the key bit to the key thing to use. Now, I already mentioned session performance on RDSH or shared systems like Windows 10 multi-user. Optimize your session performance as much as possible, because then any new users coming along will basically have a better logon experience. So you can use the likes of WEM to trim things back a bit, or UWM. Do your offloading, browser content redirection. These things are all great. One thing I will call out, apart from Teams, the biggest single drag on our performance in my current environment is Chrome. Chrome is a killer for what it does. There's lots of things you can do for Chrome. Use add-ons like the Greater Suspender and uBlock Origin. there's a little tick box that says turn off background Chrome processes, because apparently when you close Chrome, it keeps ticking away in the background so it can reload your tabs faster next time. Get lost. Get off my Synapse server with that stuff. Turn that off. Same with this crazy thing, the Chrome software report tool that literally runs there and gathers data on what you're running in the background. That's awful. Horrible feature. Get that turned off for security as well as a usability perspective. You have to literally change permissions on some folders to get that done. So disable that. I apologize for you hear my kids outside my door. They will be getting disciplined as soon as I'm finished. So also, if you're not using GPOs, there's also an option in Chrome to disable hardware acceleration. That will also make a difference around your session performance. So on a Citrix side, I mean, you're all Citrix kind of user group people, so I'm basically just teaching you how to suck eggs here. Session sharing and session pre-launch and things like that obviously make a huge difference to your user perceptions. If you're using UPM, and obviously users have large profiles, then profile streaming is handy. UPM now has all these VHD features and things like that, which allow you to basically get around that problem of bringing in large caches or large files at Logon Time. And obviously, we've already had this conversation, but treat your Citrix policies the same way as GPOs. So on the flip side, what are some bad things or indifferent things to maybe call out? Now, in group policy, we've already gone through the good things, now some of the bad. I've seen a lot of people saying, yeah, if you've got a group policy that just has computer config items in, you should go in here to the status bit that I'm showing on the left here and disable user config. This does affect your Logon Time. However, it is literally so small that there's absolutely nothing worth bothering with it for. Sorry, was that a flip back there? It's absolutely not worth bothering about. And also, because it means that you then break them down into different sort of sets of GPOs, it probably has a net negative effect. A lot of people talk about filtering. Filters can make a difference, but only if you're using particular filters that are quite long, such as computer groups, LDAP queries, product queries. Nobody usually you'd use WMI product queries. There are some group policy preference ILTs that take a while, LDAP queries, and why is my slide keeps flicking backwards and forwards. I don't know what's going on there. I hope it's not reflecting in what you can see. Item level targeting stuff such as OU queries, LDAP queries, domain, site, and computer security groups can also increase your processing time. But outside of those, I wouldn't go too mad on obsessing about getting rid of filters entirely. Don't use huge amount of filters, right? But you will need to use them from time to time. Nobody can ever have a perfect environment where there's no filtering required. Seen a lot of people talking about disabling Windows services, possibly a slight increase in session performance. Might impact the performance of your applications if you do. Logon terms, pretty low gain. I mean, you can go and disable anything, obviously, sort of, like Xbox services and things like that, but beware that law of diminishing returns. Scheduled tasks, again, is another one that's possibly worth calling out. There are some scheduled tasks that run at Logon, and Chrome is particularly notorious for that. I mean, in a non-persistent environment, yeah, get rid of the ones that do updates and things like that. But specifically for Logon Time, not a lot of scheduled tasks that run at Logon Time and need to be getting rid of. So, unless you're absolutely obsessing about every second, I wouldn't pay much attention to that. Now, there's a thing you can do, which I've got documented on my blog, and also another CTP, George Spears, has as well. You can save about 1 or 2 seconds for a log on by having it automatically log on when it's booted up for the first time. And I don't know why it does it. I think it's because it's loading stuff into memory that it otherwise would have to wait to do. So basically, you set up a startup script that sets up the auto log on. Then when it logs on, a scheduled task deletes what the startup script just set and logs back out. And it does actually make a difference of up to 2 seconds. However, it's quite busy to set up, and obviously, there are things that can go wrong with this. The obvious one is you plain text in the password into the registry, although you can use the sysinternals auto logon tool to get around that. So again, if you think that 2 seconds is going to be something your users would notice, then it might be worth it. Obviously, this applies to VDI only as well. But yeah, think about that old law of diminishing returns, but it will make a difference. Active setup is another bit that we're going to go and have a look at, which is kind of when it does this first time user config. However, even though it makes a bit of a difference in terms of logon time. It only ever applies to the first logon. So it's a user that doesn't have a profile, you know, not necessarily on the machine, just anywhere to be loaded. I think the biggest problem with active setup is that one of them hangs, it'll stop the logon entirely. So it's worth making sure that you haven't got any erroneous ones. But I think from terms of pure logon, you're going to save a couple of seconds off the first logon only. Right, I'm just quickly going to bash through because I'm aware that I'm nearly about off time as well. Drive mappings. Get rid of drive mappings. No, I'm only joking. I have this obsession about drive mappings, and don't go too crazy with that, or you'll create loads of problems for your users. There's also a bit called applications preload that does with prefetching and things like that. The details of that are on my blog as well. Prebooting for Windows 10, particularly in cloud environments. You can save some time by pre-booting them, but again, how much does it actually save you? It's like 1.2 seconds in my testing. Should you offload stuff after logon? Try not to do as much as possible. I'm just seeing a question come in saying, can I share my slides? Certainly can afterwards. And sorry for ramming through these. I'm sorry, Jason. I'm just about finished up now. I'll just quickly run through the last bits. The key takeaways, user GPU optimization and profiles are the two great places to go after, right? Go after those definitely from the off, and you'll make the biggest gains. If you've got suboptimal storage, then look at getting that upgraded, but particularly look at all your other components outside of your VDAs as well. Security tools config will make a big difference as well, not just antivirus we're talking here. UWP applications, get rid of as many as possible or use fast first sign-in. Always try and optimize your session performance, and always make sure you do all of that baselining and testing, right? That is the key part. If you don't understand what's happening, and from that human perspective as well, then you will never, ever be able to effectively optimize your logon times. Right, as I said, I'm getting harassed in the chat here, so I will try and answer the questions that are left over in some other way. Hopefully I'll be able to do them in when I get them in a second.
All right. Yeah, I'm jumping in. Sorry. Just a quick reminder, we're going to be ending this. So just hit the main page to visit our sponsor booths. And then don't forget, there is the passport questions. Get those answers and submitted. And thanks, everybody, for attending. So like I said, be sure to go visit our sponsors and give them some love. Thanks.